When we look at the current situation in the blessed lands of Sham, Palestine and the surrounding areas, Gaza, and we look at the situation at Masjid al-Aqsa, then at this point, we're all looking to find some hope, to find something that would uplift our spirits. And there's one personality in the annals of history who had attained a remarkable feat in this regard. And that is why when we talk about him, when we reflect on his life, it brings a sense of hope to the ummah. Like the Arabic nasheed says, Al-Islamu ya'innu jarihan fi ardi Filistin. Al-Islamu ya'innu yunadi ayna Salahuddin. The land of Palestine, the land of Sham, is a broken land. And it is as though, with the circumstances we are experiencing, there's a call to say, where is Salahuddin? Where is there someone who can raise to that caliber and achieve the feat that Salahuddin, rahimahumullah, had attained? Now, when we look back at the circumstances of the great feat that Sultan Salahuddin had attained, which was the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa, it was around 488, where at that time there were two centers of Christian power. You had the Romans, were the Catholics, and they were around Rome. And then you had in Constantinople the Eastern Orthodox Christians. And there was always a tussle between the two for the dominance. And Pope Urban II had given a speech in Clement in France, where he had called on all the Christians at that time to join a crusade to Jerusalem, with the intention of liberating this land and saying that this was the birthplace of Jesus and it was for them a great honor to liberate this land. He was a very fiery orator, and with his speech he stirred up emotions. There was a simpleton who was also, one of the high-ranking officials in the church, Peter the Hermit, and he immediately undertook a crusade. But he wasn't organized. He didn't have much army personnel. He didn't have much equipment. And he set out from Rome and marched across Europe, past Constantinople. The Seljuk ruler of that time was able to stop him and send him back. There was then a second attempt by the Christians to try and march onto Palestine. And this time it was a more organized effort. They marched from Rome all the way to Turkey, Constantinople, and then made their way right down Anatolia, coming to Al-Aqsa, Al-Quds, Jerusalem. Along the way, there was pockets of resistance. The Seljuks had attempted to stop them, but the Muslims were in disarray at that time. They were divided. It was the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, who was ruling from Iraq. On the other hand, this entire region of the Levant and Egypt was under Fatimiyat, the Shias, and they were only focused on their own enrichment and looking after themselves. The Christians were then able to march onto Palestine, onto Al-Quds, and they laid siege on Jerusalem for 42 days, eventually penetrating the walls of the city and entering the city of Jerusalem. When they entered, they immediately started the bloodshed. They killed thousands of people. They chopped off the necks of the Muslimin. They started, decapitating, and the bloodshed had no bounds. Some of the Muslims thought that if we go to the Masjid al-Aqsa compound, we'll take refuge there and we will save ourselves. But the Crusader army went into Masjid al-Aqsa. And there they continued their savagery. And they continued to slaughter the Muslims until the point had reached that the bodies had been stacked up so high that it was higher than the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And the blood was flowing to such an extent that it reached the knees of the horses of the Crusaders. Babies' heads were thrown against the walls. And that was the order of the day. They eventually left the Al-Aqsa compound when the stench of the corpse was so much that they could no longer bear it. And this was the beginning of an 88-year siege of Al-Aqsa. Azan was no longer given in Masjid Al-Aqsa. Salah was no longer performed. The cross was put onto the dome of the rock masjid. The Qibli masjid, which is the masjid where we perform salah now, that was set aside as a horse and a pig's pen. Where the mihrab is, that was turned into a lavatory for them to relieve themselves. And this continued for a number of years. 40 years after the siege of Masjid al-Aqsa, the sword from amongst the swords of Allah was born, Salahuddin, in 532 after Hijrah. When his mother still carried him in her womb, she saw a dream, and in the dream there was an announcement that in your womb is a sword from the swords of Allah. He was born in a fort in Tikrit, which is a city on the eastern banks of the Tigris River. And this is an area where the Kurds resided. Because of some misunderstanding, at just a few days after his birth, his father, Najmuddin, and his uncle Shirku, with their families, had to leave Tikrit. And they then moved to Mosul, and they moved then to Damascus. And that is where he grew up. He grew up in a home where not a day passed without the mention of the Masjid al-Aqsa in his home. And he grew up, he attained his initial Islamic knowledge in around Damascus. At that time, the ruler was Imaduddin, and he was a Seljuk ruler. And he was close to the family of Salahuddin. And Salahuddin's father and his uncle were appointed as army generals. As Salahuddin was growing up, daily he would go to the army barracks. You would see the soldiers training. You would visit the stables. You would see all of them training, and this created the fervor for jihad in his blood. As he grew up as a young man, rising through the ranks very quickly, and as time had passed, he was then appointed as the chief of all the police of Damascus. And he did his job as a young man par excellence, to such an extent that he was being praised. His actual name was Yusuf, the son of Najmuddin, the son of Shadi. And a poet had composed some poetry and said that, addressing the criminals of Damascus, that beware of the man by the name of Yusuf. Yusuf the Nabi, the ladies cut their fingers because of him. But this man Yusuf, he cuts the hands of the criminals, so be aware of his presence. So he had taken up a good position in this regard, and he became well known. Najmuddin was in charge, was the Seljuk ruler, and he passed on. And in fact, it was Imaduddin, and Nuruddin, then his son, took over. His son then maintained the relationship between Salahuddin's family and the Seljuk ruler's family. It was the time of the Shia Khilafat, and they had control over Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Muslim world. Whoever controlled Egypt, it was a critical point. It was at that point that Nuruddin had then sent Salahuddin's uncle Shirku and Salahuddin towards Egypt. They then laid siege on Alexandria, and they were successful. Salahuddin then was appointed as the governor of Alexandria. At that time, the Shia Fatimiyat wasn't in a good stead in Egypt. People were unhappy because of the high taxes they had to pay. They had also changed the azan. They had added words, As-salah, Hayya ala khairil amal. They had added certain inappropriate statements against the Sahaba and against Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Umar in the khutbah. And there were many things that they had perpetrated. Salahuddin first established himself over Alexandria, and then the Fatimiyat dynasty of Egypt had asked for assistance in ruling over Egypt, and he was then appointed as the Wazir of Cairo. And he then ruled with justice. People were inclined to him. And as the result of that, he grew popular amongst the people. He then created a movement against the Shia Fatimiyya dynasty, and he was eventually able to isolate them. The palaces that they had kept for themselves and all the luxury, he made that available for the general public, and they were very happy with that. He put the army to live over there, and that is what won over the hearts of the people. The Al-Azhar University was actually founded during the Fatimiyya rule. It was actually a Shia university, and it was Salahuddin who then changed it and brought it onto the manhaj of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, where throughout the ages many great ulama had emerged from that university. When he now had become the Wazir of Egypt, he focused on the establishments of madrasas and the propagation of deen, which is the cornerstone of our deen of Islam. And it said from the madrasas that he had established, the likes of Imam Ghazali rahimahumullah, Abu Bakr Tartusi and others had emerged. This is part of his legacy. While he was in Egypt, the news had come that Nuruddin had now passed on. He was assassinated, and his son, who was an 11-year-old, was now put as the ruler of Sham, the Levant. And that different groupings were now eyeing to take him out. It was at that point that Salahuddin marched with his army from Cairo into Sham. And he then annexed that land. And then for 12 hard years, he worked on unifying the Muslim Ummah. There were the Shias, there were other groupings that he had to go into combat with to bring them under one banner. And eventually, he had brought that entire region with Egypt, the Levant and Iraq and all of that under one banner. It was then that the Crusaders, who were still in Jerusalem, in Al-Aqsa, had felt threatened. And that is when they had made an advance towards the army of Salahuddin. And this was around 583 after Hijrah. So it was now, Salahuddin was just around 50 years old or more. And it was now 89 years of Crusader occupation of Palestine, of Masjid al-Aqsa. And this was when the army of the Crusaders had marched out towards Salahuddin. Salahuddin had the Muslim world now behind him, and they were backing him. He then strategically moved towards his army towards a place called Tabariyah. And this was a place, a higher ground where there was some grazing land and water. But the route towards Tabariyah was a rugged terrain without water. And it was through a valley. And he had positioned himself, and this was his strategic thinking and his astute military insight that he had, that he positioned himself knowing that when they come through this valley, this would be a difficult journey for them. And this would tire them out. And they will come to a point where they won't have water. So he had planned this. And eventually, the army then came to the point of Hattin. And there's two mountains, and the two armies met there. Salahuddin had stationed his archers on the mountains. So as the Crusader army was marching towards Hattin, there was already the archers of Salahuddin firing on them. The battle of Hattin then starts. On the one hand, Salahuddin has 12,000. On the other hand, the Crusaders have more than 70,000. The first day of the battle takes place. There are fierce fighting on both sides. None of the two parties emerge victorious. It is on the second day where the morale of the Crusaders starts to drop. The king of Tripoli sees how the things are going, and he thinks, you know what? There's nothing going to come out of this. Let me leave. So he leaves. With his leaving, this breaks the morale of the Crusaders somewhat. The battle continues, and it's hot. There's a wind blowing. Salahuddin then comes with a magnificent plan. He then instructs his army to surround the army of the Crusaders. And with the wind blowing, he lights up all the dry grass. and the wind is blowing in the direction of the Crusader army, with the fire that is now burning and the smoke going in their direction and the lack of water that they had. This all together comes together and it then demoralizes them. They start choking on the smoke. And he said that as the winds were blowing in their direction, you could hear on the one hand, they were choking on the smoke, and on the other hand, you could hear the takbeers from the Muslim army. And this was a critical moment where Salahuddin's army gained the upper hand of the Crusaders. Eventually, there was just around 150 knights that stood with their leader. And all the others were either taken as captive or were slain on the battlefield. Salahuddin then approaches the leader. And this was the very leader who, prior to this, was causing chaos in this entire region. He was stopping the Hujjaj from going to the Hijaz. And he had made some derogatory comments. And he said that, when he would stop the Hujjaj, where are you going? They would say to Makkah, to Medina. You'd say, I'm going to march to Makkah to Al-Mukarramah and I'm going to destroy the Baytullah. If I go to Medina, I will exhume the body of Muhammad. And then he would slay them and he would say, where is Muhammad to defend you? Where is Aina Muhammad yudafi'u anka? So this leader would make these derogatory comments. Salahuddin was fully aware of this. And he was in the last 150 who were holding out. Salahuddin's special forces around him then vanquished them. And he called for this person to come forth. When he came forth, Salahuddin asked him that, do you want to accept Islam? And he said, no. And he said then, are you the one who said this and this? Are you the one who said, where is Muhammad to defend? And he acknowledged and he said this. Salahuddin then slayed him and said, today we've taken revenge on behalf of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he said that the scenes that unfolded after this, the Muslim army was in such a strong position that they took the Crusaders as captives, as prisoners. And one Muslim man would tie 30 captives on one string and he would lead them and they would follow. And there was a faqih in the Muslim army and his sandals broke. So he had more than 30 captives under him. And one of his friends also had a few captives, but his friends had a sandal that he wanted. So he said to him that, give me the sandals and I'll pay you what one of these prisoners. So someone was there, said that, how can you pay with a person for a pair of sandals? So he said, the sole reason why I'm doing this is to show how cheap these Crusaders are today, that they're not even worth the pair of sandals. So this particular victory that the Muslims had attained in Hattin had now paved the way for Salahuddin. And this was in 583 after Hijrah. Salahuddin did not immediately move towards Al-Quds al-Sharif, but he then went towards the coast to block off all the ports so that the Crusaders do not get any reinforcements. And when he was successful with that, and he had now blocked off all the ports, there were just one or two places that remained. There was a city by the name of Tai that still remained under the Crusaders. When he was satisfied, he now moved towards Al-Quds al-Sharif. He laid siege on the city for a few days. He started his siege on the 21st of Rajab, 583 after Hijrah. And the siege continued just for a few days when the leader, Crusader leader of Al-Quds, Jerusalem, came out and wanted to enter into a truce with Salahuddin. Salahuddin was reluctant and said, no, we want to go forth with taking the city in our way, with our control. And Balian, who was the leader of the Crusaders, said that there are still some remnants of Muslims that are living here, and if you continue, we won't fight you, but we will slay all of them. So Salahuddin then agreed to take over the city with a truce with Balian. And Salahuddin then, on the 27th of Rajab, 583 Hijrah, on a Yawmul Jummah, had entered into Palestine, Al-Quds Sharif. And he entered after 89 years of occupation of the Crusaders. But the scenes at that time was different. Salahuddin had announced that whoever wants to be freed, they had to pay their ransom. He said that the children and the women of the knights who fought in the army against them, since they don't have anyone to pay for them, they are free automatically. Whoever is old, they will be freed. And he made the amount minimum. But the Crusaders were so obsessed about their own wealth that those who had wealth fled. And those who were poor, they left them. There were sultans from the Muslims who would pay for the non-Muslims their fidya and free them. There was in fact a Christian patriarch who noticed how easy it was to engage in good deeds. He asked that some of the prisoners be handed over to him, and then he freed them. At that day, Salahuddin, whose name was Yusuf, he acted in the same way that Nabi Yusuf ﷺ had acted when his brothers had come to him and they had recognized him, and he said, La tathriba alaykumul yawm. There is no rebuke against you today. And Nabi Sallallahu made the same announcement when he entered into Makkatul Mukarramah. Salahuddin also announced that. It was after 83 years that the Salah was now being performed in Masjid al-Aqsa. The cross was taken down. The masjid was cleansed. A carpet was then laid in the masjid. It was cleansed from all the dirt. The latrines that were built were destroyed. Nuruddin Zangi had prepared a mihrab 20 years ago, 20 years before that. And that mihrab was then brought into Masjid al-Aqsa and it was put. And then 7 days later, on the 4th of Shawwal, that was when the first Jummah was established in Masjid al-Aqsa. When the Muazzin had called out the Azan and the Imam had gone onto the Mimbar and had performed the khutbah after the period of close to 100 years. The land was now purified from the evil. Salahuddin's immediate focus was again on establishing madrasas, spreading the knowledge of deen, because he provided us with that message that it is central for every movement, for any change, that we educate ourselves, and that is the cornerstone of any change that will take place in the world. Salahuddin then continued to remain in Masjid al-Aqsa. There were then several attempts by the Crusaders to recapture. And the city that they still had, from there they launched several attacks. They were actually then able to make some progress to a city called Akku. And they then had entered into a treatment, but when they entered, they violated the treatment and slaughtered all the Muslims. The jihad had continued for many years. Now, and Salahuddin's army was also wearing down. And there was now talk of them marching on to Al-Quds one more time. Salahuddin was very, very perturbed. His own biographer, Ibn Shaddad, and his confidant, Qadi Al-Fazil, were by his side. And they say that that night, Salahuddin spent the entire night making dua to Allah, weeping in the same way Nabi Sallallahu spent the night on the night before Badr. How Nabi Sallallahu made dua, Salahuddin also made dua that night. And somehow, the one who was leading the campaign against the Muslims one more time, he then became ill and he abandoned the entire project and he left. The Muslims then were secure for a while and they remained in Al-Aqsa, in Al-Quds, continuing with their various campaigns. Salahuddin stayed there for 6 years. During this time, establishing justice, sitting as a qazi. Then in the year 588, he had performed Ramadan in Al-Quds al-Sharif. And then the desire came to return to his hometown to spend some time with his family in Damascus. After Ramadan, he went back to his town. While he was there, he would spend time with the Muslimin, he would pass judgment, and he would also occasionally go on hunting expeditions. It was then just after the time of Hajj when Salahuddin had met the Hujjaj and he inquired about the well-being of all the Muslimin that they had met and the condition in the Haramain. Salahuddin, because of his preoccupation with jihad, had never performed Hajj in his life. It was his desire that he perform Hajj, but it was the sacrifice that he was never given the opportunity to perform Hajj. He became ill, and his illness continued to exacerbate. And his confidant and his biographer, Ibn Shaddad, would visit him time and again. And they seen his condition deteriorating. And he was getting sick and more sick. And it was on a Wednesday when Qadi al-Fazil had visited him, and he then appointed a Qari to remain by his bedside and to recite the Noble Quran. On a Wednesday morning, around the time of Fajr, when the Qari had come to the verse, Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illahu, it was at that moment that Salahuddin had left this world. He passed away with a smile on his face. He passed away at Fajr time. The ghusl and the kafan arrangement was made, and his burial, his janazah salah took place after Dhuhr salah, and he was then buried around Asr time. For 3 days, there was programs in the masjid speaking about his manaqib and eulogizing him. And the Muslim Ummah mourned this great loss, a great soldier from amongst the soldiers of Allah. Qadi al-Fazil had suggested and had given the decree that Salahuddin should be buried with his sword, so that on the day of Qiyamah he be resurrected with that sword with which he had liberated Masjid al-Aqsa. The feat that he had attained in the battle of Hattin, Allama Zahabi rahimahullah said that victory was the greatest victory that the Muslims had attained in the Levant after the battle of Yarmouk, which Khalid bin Walid radiyallahu anhu had attained. And Allama ibn Athir, the great historian, says that in terms of the praise of Salahuddin, it is sufficient that history will record him alongside Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu. That is sufficient that can be recorded as his praise. So when we look at, Salahuddin's life, it was the military genius on the one hand, it was his spirituality on the other hand, and it was his dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that all together had culminated to bring about that victory. He had to deal with the menace of the Shias, and he had to fight them so that the Muslim could progress. Within our own ranks, the munafiqeen, they have to be dealt with, so that only then we are able to put a united front, and it's only when there's unity that the Muslim can go forth. Salahuddin was not the chosen one. Salahuddin chose to be the one. He was not a Sahabi. He was not from Arab descent, from the descent of the Prophet ﷺ. He was a Kurdish Muslim from noble descent. But with his desire, with his acumen, with the ability that Allah had granted him, he became the one. And in that, we need to now ask ourselves, what is the sacrifice that we are going to do for the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa? Every one of us have a role. We may not see the fruit of our efforts now, but we do what we need to do with the hope that it will bring about the result someday. It is said that Salahuddin was never seen smiling. And he was asked that, "Oh Salahuddin, oh Sultan, throughout your life you never smile." He says, "How can I smile while Masjid al-Aqsa is in the hands of the Crusaders? How can I smile when Masjid al-Aqsa is in the hands of the Crusaders?" This was the yearning. This was the concern. So we can never become indifferent. We can never normalize the situation and just continue with our lives. May Allah Rabbul Izzah liberate Masjid al-Aqsa and grant ease to the Muslim Ummah in all parts of the world. May Allah give us a hand in that so that we can also gain the reward of that. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.